Hello, students. I hope you're doing well, of course. We need to finish our discussion of Book 2 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. So far, we've covered chapters 1 through 6 of Book 2, right? And in those chapters, Aristotle built up to this definition of virtue, right? And according to this definition, which includes the genus and the differentia, virtue is a state of the soul. That's its genus. What kind of state is it? Well, the differentia is, the distinguishing feature is, it decides on the mean relative to us, the mean that the prudent person or the practically wise person would decide on. Okay, so one thing I want to add to the discussion we've already had of that definition is, of course, the virtue can't literally decide. I haven't commented on this point yet. So that can't be what Aristotle means. He actually has a fairly elaborate definition of decision, as we'll see. That's in book 3, right? So the virtue is just a state or a disposition. It can't decide. What he means is it disposes us to decide in a certain way, or it gives us a tendency, or it gives us a nudge such that we decide in the right way, right? So it helps us decide. It helps us decide by giving us a predisposition. Okay. And so, how does that work? Well, in general terms, my emotions are trained as I develop the virtue. Simultaneously, my judgments are honed, right? So there's always this balancing act. I have to navigate my own emotional states, but I also have to respond to reason. So over time, as I say, respond to danger, and I stand firm in the face of it, and I occasionally retreat because it will give me a tactical advantage, and maybe this enemy couldn't be defeated at this time, right? As I do that sort of thing, I train my fear, I train my confidence, I develop better judgment about which enemies can be vanquished at which times, right? I get a sense for the opportune time. Remember that discussion. Um, okay, so I'm honing judgments and I'm dealing with my emotional life at the same time, right? And so that's why the state both predisposes me, it gives me the right emotional impetus, but it also decides in the way that the prudent person would. The prudent person is the one with fully developed practical wisdom or judgment, right? And I'm honing my judgment, approaching that ideal, so that I'm going to have a predisposition to judge in the right way because I have been developing virtue. Okay, so that should make sense at a general level. Now we go to the chart. Aristotle mentions a chart, right? So I feel like I need to give you a chart. I don't know exactly what Aristotle's looked like. This could be worse, but it could be better. I don't know. Um, but I should tell you that a lot of the discussion of the individual virtues are missing from our textbook, right? So if you have a full copy of the Nicomachean Ethics, you'll see that Aristotle revisits the individual virtues, right? He looks at them in chapter 7 of book 2, but then in the last several chapters of book 3 and all of book 4, he talks about those individual virtues some more and gives us more detail, right? So if you have a full copy of the Nicomachean Ethics accessible to you, you might want to look at that. The latest discussion post involves talking about a specific virtue. So if you could find that information, that would be valuable to you. But for my part, what I've done is I've tried to work that information into the table. Okay. So the table has some information that you didn't read. Right? And I've drawn that from other parts of the text that you don't have access to, but you could get access to. Also, sometimes I'm speculating, and I'll let you know um, when I'm definitely speculating, right? So sometimes there's a bit of a gray area. I'm trying to infer what Aristotle is saying. Sometimes my inferences are really well grounded in things that he says, and sometimes I'm kind of speculating or riffing because his discussion is incomplete in some ways, especially when it comes to feelings. Okay. So, he says more than once that virtue has to do with action and feeling. He's always specific about the actions. Sometimes he doesn't really tell you what feeling he has in mind, but that is part of the theory that virtues help us develop our feelings and cultivate them in the right direction. So I've filled out this table in such a way that every virtue corresponds to action and feeling, right? And again, I'll try to let you know when I'm speculating, but also again, there is that little gray area where, I don't necessarily know how speculative I'm being in any given case. I'm trying to infer what he's doing, and sometimes I've got a lot of textual evidence, and sometimes it's a little murky. Okay, well anyway, let's try. Um, so I've divided up the table into primary virtues, or we could call them cardinal virtues, and then virtues concerned with the distribution of goods. We'll see what that means later. I'm just telling you, this is a high level distinction. Primary virtues, virtues concerned with distribution, and then virtues that help us get along with others. Okay, so those aren't Aristotle's distinctions. I just think it's helpful to have a very high level distinction. So we get these three broad categories. Okay, so primary virtues, I call these primary virtues because Aristotle tends to mention them whenever he mentions virtue in general. If he's going to give examples, he's probably going to mention these two virtues. Which two? Bravery and temperance. Okay. So you can see that for each virtue, I've got a row that tells you the state, and the mean state for bravery is bravery, of course. Bravery is the middle condition, or the middle state, or the mean state. It's between the deficiency of cowardice and the excess of rashness, as you should be able to see pretty clearly on the table here. I've blown it up pretty big for you, so that should help, right? Okay, so why well, first of all, what is bravery? Well, it's standing firm in the face of danger, and in the later discussion, Aristotle says, well, especially, you know, this has to do with facing the fear of death. So, of course, bravery has to do with feelings, right? Every virtue does. The feelings involved here are fear and confidence. And then Aristotle says bravery especially has to do with dealing with your fear of death, not just any death, but death where there are possibilities for action, right? So of course that's well suited to the battlefield. Um, If you're sick with a terrible disease, there may not be much opportunity for action. And I'm not saying it's not me. I'm not saying you can't face illness bravely. I'm not trying to offend anybody. I am saying if you look at Aristotle's view, his paradigm is military virtue. That's how he's thinking of bravery. So he's thinking of it as involved with the fear of death when you can sort of escape death through your own heroic action. That's his paradigm case, which would mean facing illness bravely would be sort of an analog case. It wouldn't be our primary focus case. And I'm telling you that to be informative. I did offend a student once saying these things, but I'm just trying to tell you what Aristotle is telling us, right? Okay, so the brave person faces dangers appropriately or even pursues them appropriately, right? So that's what's involved with the mean state. It disposes you to face or pursue dangers appropriately. If you're a coward, you run away from danger too much. I mean, the brave person might run away from danger. It could happen. The coward does it too much. The rash person, who is in the state of rashness, of course, pursues danger too much, runs into it recklessly, right? And then, of course, the feelings involved are too, as I've already said. So the brave person experiences mean or moderate confidence. Confidence is involved here. I'm confident I can handle the danger, right? The rash person is overconfident. Not surprisingly, I can handle any danger. I'm going for it, right? That's reckless. You're going to end up dead. And then, of course, that's not wise. How can you help your city state? How can you help Athens if you're dead? You got to stay alive to the extent that you can while also facing the dangers that you can vanquish, right? It's a balance. It's a mean. Okay, and then the coward, of course, has deficient confidence, but the coward is more characterized, Aristotle says in the later discussion, by excessive fear. The coward is pained. The coward is in pain. You can tell by looking at the coward who is maybe collapsing or running away or just overwhelmed with fear, right? Um, so the table's a little weird here, right? When it comes to confidence, cowardice goes with deficient confidence. So the deficient state goes with deficient confidence, but I had to put excessive fear under the coward. So these don't all line up perfectly. So there is an excess on the side of deficiency. There's an excess of fear. And of course, there's a deficiency on the side of excess, right? Because the rash person has too little fear. If they had more fear, they would stay more in bounds. They wouldn't pursue those dangers that they shouldn't. And the brave person has the appropriate amount of fear. The brave person is definitely not fearless. And in fact, Aristotle says that's a different vice that we don't see very often. So there's being rash, right? If you're sort of within the human bounds of rashness, you still have some fear in there somewhere. Um, but he thinks maybe some people just, there's something wrong with them and they don't have any fear. He treats that as a different kind of case. There's the fearless case. Yeah, Aristotle thinks there's something wrong there. Fear is good. Why? Because it provides motivation to get away from danger. And some dangers we can't vanquish, right? So that's a good thing. Okay, so that's bravery for you. Then there's temperance, right? Temperance is situated between insensibility and intemperance. Insensibility is not a word we use much. Aristotle's explanation for that is, well, there aren't very many insensible people, right? So normally the issue with temperance is that we tend to want to be intemperate, right? And that's why we don't think much about insensibility. In other words, the temperate person enjoys moderate pleasures moderately. That's the characteristic action of the temperate person, just like standing firm in the face of danger and even pursuing it when it's appropriate is the characteristic action of the brave person, right? The temperate person characteristically um, enjoys these pleasures that are acceptable to an acceptable degree, right? And to some extent, refraining is the characteristic action of the temperate person. When the temperate person has had enough food, it's time to refrain. When the temperate person has had enough alcohol, it's time to refrain, right? So there's something about refraining at the right time in the right way that's characteristic of the temperate person, but of course that's kind of the same thing as enjoying these moderate pleasures moderately, maybe two sides of the same coin, two different descriptions of the same thing. The intemperate person, of course, indulges too much. The insensible person, which hardly exists, abstains from pleasure too much, right? Okay, I've got a spelling error there. Sorry. Can't really fix it right now. Um, okay, so the insensible person abstains too much, but people really like pleasure, so yeah, this barely occurs, right? Um, let's see. Okay, I did fix it after all. I wasn't sure I could fix it while sharing the screen. Um, anyway, this insensible person, stays away from pleasures that are okay, right? You should eat enough to nourish yourself. It's okay, if you're not an alcoholic. If you're an alcoholic, you should probably stay sober, but it's okay to have a drink for social reasons at a party, right? And the insensible person won't do it, or that certainly that's one kind of insensible person. There are different kinds of pleasures, so there are different kinds of insensible people, right? And then what's the feeling involved here? Um, well, it's the desire for pleasure, basically, is what it is, right? So the temperate person has this moderate, well-modulated desire for pleasure, and again experiences them in a moderate way when having them. The intemperate person, of course, experiences this excessive desire for pleasure that's hard to deal with and could be carried away by pleasure when actually experiencing it. Like this person could really be overwhelmed by pleasure, such that they lose control and they just keep pursuing pleasure and they get into a bit of a cycle until physically they have to stop, right? So they've lost control of themselves. That's what can happen with the intemperate person. And then the insensible person is just not interested enough in pleasure. Pleasure is good. I believe I said this earlier when we were discussing happiness. Aristotle's view is that pleasure is good. It's just that that is qualified, right? Because it's not that any pleasure at all is good, no matter what. It's just that pleasure is good and it can be part of the good life, but particular pleasures are bad and excessive pleasure is bad. And so you have to maintain control, which is what the intemperate person fails to do. Okay. All right. So those are the cardinal virtues or the primary virtues. And then there are virtues concerned with the distribution of goods. What do I mean by that? Well, there are actually physical goods involved here. There's wealth. Some of these have to do with distributing wealth, which could be in the form of money or could be in the form of material goods. Some of these have to do with the distribution of honor, which is a social good. And so to me, these all go together. They have a similar structure. Okay, so first of all, there's generosity. That's the mean state. We can recognize that. We know that's a virtue. Um, the generous person gives and takes moderately. So here there are two characteristic actions in a way. Um, Aristotle decides, he could separate these, I suppose, but he decides, well, the generous person gives and takes the right amount. Okay. And this is at the personal level. There's a different virtue for acting at the social or institutional level, right? So when you're just dealing with other people and what they need, including your family and friends, um, you can give the right amount, you can take the right amount if you need it. Now, of course, you're supposed to try to be self-sufficient, so don't take too much, but maybe people want to give you gifts and you don't want to be rude, right? So there is a right amount to take and a right amount to give. Um, the deficiency here, it could be called acquisitiveness. I've also seen it translated as ungenerosity. Acquisitiveness, that's what I'm trying to say, emphasizes the taking, right? And it doesn't emphasize that this person is giving too little. So I do like the term ungenerosity as well. I wasn't sure which one to pick, so I put both there as the deficient state. Certainly acquiring things doesn't sound deficient, but lack of generosity, ungenerosity, not giving enough, that sounds deficient. That helps us make more sense of why this is the deficient state. And then, of course, the excess is wastefulness, just being extravagant, giving away too much, giving away too many gifts, not taking care of your wealth, basically, right? Is what it comes down to. So here is one place where I'm speculating about the feelings involved. Um, Aristotle doesn't really mention feelings specifically here, but here's what I'm getting out of the discussion. If you're in the mean state of generosity, giving and taking moderately, you have the right amount of self-love and self-concern. You're looking out for yourself. You're trying to take care of your wealth. Um, you want to use it to help people. That's what wealth is for. So you can't completely dissipate it, right? But you should give some. Wealth is an instrumental good. Money is an instrumental good. It's for getting things. It's for doing things. It's meant to be spent, right? To a degree, to an extent. Um, so you've gotta have enough self-concern and self-love to hold on to that wealth, some core of it, right? So that you can continue to help others over time, right? Hard to make money when you don't have any at all. I think we know that already, right? So the deficiency of ungenerosity seems to go with the feeling of selfishness. That certainly makes sense. I want to hold on to my wealth. I don't want to give it to you, even though you need it. I'm just putting myself too much above others, right? I do have to have some self-concern, but I'm thinking of myself as way too important here if I refuse to help anybody with my wealth. So that's selfishness. And then if I'm being wasteful, there's a lack of self-concern, right? I'm not paying enough attention to my own needs. I'm not thinking about future Jeff in particular, right? I've got to hold on to some of this wealth. I got to take care of myself. I got to be able to retire someday, right? So that's all important. And then I did also include the feeling of compassion because, of course, self-concern and self-love and selfishness and lack of self-concern, that's all self-oriented and that plays a role. But compassion makes you want to help others. So then again, this is speculative. Aristotle doesn't say these things. It seems like the ungenerous person is deficient in compassion. It's not just that it's not just that he or she is too selfish, but also on the flip side, isn't concerned enough about others, just isn't feeling the pain of others who are in need. Something's wrong, there's a block there, right? The generous person has moderate compassion that makes them want to help others. And the wasteful person has excessive compassion or concern with others and seems to be overwhelmed by it at times and forgets to look out for him or herself, which is necessary in order to really hold on to that wealth and use it well. Okay, so I think that's helpful. Magnificence is sort of the same thing at a grand level or a city-state level or some kind of institutional level. The magnificent person helps the community or the political unit, whatever, maybe the city. Maybe this person is really civically minded. It's hard to translate this one a bit because Aristotle has this idea of the polis, right? We're in the polis, we're in the Greek city-state. Of course, our magnificence is directed at the city-state. So it's hard to know exactly what the target here is in the modern day when you're trying to translate the virtue. Um, I think it could go more than one way. It could be a matter of helping your city. It could be a matter of helping a community that you belong to. Like maybe you're in a church community, maybe you're in the LGBTQ plus community. Like you could belong to any number of different communities. Anyway, if you're magnificent, you're helping at this broader level, right? I was the I was the president of the board of an LGBTQ plus choir. Um, and the board members gave of their time and money, and so maybe that was my one dabbling with magnificence as opposed to personal generosity, right? Because I was helping a community and not just an individual. But I'll leave it for you to decide. I shouldn't promote my own virtue. um if you're stingy, right, that word is clear enough. You lack, you don't, well, you don't want to help the community for some reason. You don't help them. You won't help. You have to have the resources to do it in order to be stingy. You can't be stingy because you're poor, right? So you have to have some wealth. Um, and then if you have enough that you could actually help at a broad institutional level, and then you don't, then you're stingy. The magnificent person, of course, provides the right amount of help. I'm just realizing I cut something off there a little bit. Okay, so hope that helps. Right, so the magnificent person provides appropriate help to the polis slash community. The extravagant person is an interesting case, I think, right? Why? Because they spend they spend money on unnecessary things. It's not that they spend too much money, period, the end. It's not clear that that would make sense. It's more like they want to put their stamp on things or they want to put their name on things, right? So for instance, if you want to, this is Aristotle's example, it's in the later discussion. If you want to buy robes for the choir, that's cool. Um, then you're being civically minded, you're being magnificent. If you want to get these robes in the nicest purple dye, the most expensive you can find as a way of sort of showing off, like, look, I got you the very best robes with the very best purple. Purple dye was particularly expensive in the ancient Greek world, apparently. Well, now you're just showing off, right? It's like we said about generosity, hold on to that wealth so you can continue to be useful. The choir didn't need the best, most expensive purple. They needed robes, right? So you're using money that doesn't need to be used, and now you have less for future purposes, and you're trying to show off, it would seem, right? So the feelings involved here are I'm going to go with appropriate civic spirit for the mean state. That's what motivates the mean state here, the magnificent person. The stingy person has a lack of civic spirit, they're deficient. And then with the extravagant person, I'm not going to say they have too much civic spirit because again, that doesn't really, I'm not sure that makes sense. It's that their civic spirit is overwhelmed by a desire to show off. So they make it too personal, right? If you're gonna help the community, help the community. Um, if you're showing off, that shows that you lost focus, right? So your civic spirit was overwhelmed by something more personal, right? The desire to show off, I'm claiming. Okay, so I think that works. I hope that makes sense. And then we have magnanimity, which has to do with big honors. So you have the right relationship to big honors. The action involved is pursuing appropriate honors. These are big ones appropriately. Um, Pusillanimity is the deficient state. You disdain honors. Um, you could pursue them, but you just poo-poo them for some reason. You got a little bit of contempt, maybe. With vanity, if you're vain, um, you pursue the honors too eagerly. And we're talking about big honors, so what does that involve? Well, that's relative. So really big honors, are things like the Nobel Prize and the presidency, stuff like that, really high level, or being a senator, say, of the United States. Those are really big honors, right? So you could pursue those appropriately. Um, you have to actually be worthy, right? By pursuing honors that you're not worthy of, you're being vain. But if you're worthy and you pursue it in a moderate way and you don't get too competitive and you're not totally convinced that you're going to get the honor and it's in the bag, that would be vain, right? You're being magnanimous in that case. So I don't know who to pick without being contentious. But I'll tell you who maybe was pusillanimous, according to Aristotle at least. Um, Sartre wouldn't accept a Nobel Prize for literature. And we could get into why, and this it's complicated. But he's one of my own. He's a philosopher, so I feel like I have to bring him up. He wouldn't take the prize, yeah, and maybe there are good reasons, but Aristotle apparently would think, hey, you know, people are trying to honor you. Um, you've written a lot, you've written important things, you're worthy. Um, why have this disdain? Why have this contempt? It seems to go toward the pusillanimous side. I mean, I'm not a mind reader. I don't know exactly what Aristotle would have thought if he knew all the details of Sartre's case. Um, but I'm not being too contentious. Presumably, you don't have strong feelings about Sartre, so I feel like I can bring that up as an example, right? And then pursuing honors too eagerly. Like if you're a rap star and you haven't done anything but record music, and you haven't engaged in political activism, and you haven't kept up with political developments, you're not really informed about international affairs, um, and then you run for president. I do have someone in mind, I'm not going to say the name. That seems vain, right? You're sort of putting yourself forward like, I could do this job. Um, well, granted, not everybody who gets the job is worthy anyway. Maybe you could do better than someone who's had the job. And still, right? Yeah, if you're not worthy, so that would be, I'm just trying to give you not quite a name, but a well-shaped idea of what would be vain here, right? You're pursuing it, but you're not worthy. You want to be senator, you want to be president, but you don't even pay attention to political stuff. You have no idea what's going on with policy or international affairs, anything like that. Maybe you don't even know who your own elected representatives are, or what they've voted for, or what they haven't voted for, right? So that would be vain if that happened. And then, well, what's really big here? I got tenure recently. Professors eventually try to get tenure if they're at all eligible, if that's something they can get. Um, So that to me, that's a big honor. I'm not I'm not sure I'm suited for being a senator or anything like that. Well, I'm pretty sure I'm not suited for being a senator or anything like that. I don't think I have it in me to do that kind of work and pay attention to that sort of thing, right? So I'll go for a smaller honor, but maybe still unusual enough to count as a little bit big, if that even is that a sensible phrase? Right. So, when you get tenure, that means the university is saying you're good enough that we're going to keep you around. In other words, tenure comes with certain protections, right? And not everybody gets it, so it's a bit of an honor, at least. And then I guess if you just didn't feel like you had anything to contribute as a professor, and you sort of gave up on the very idea of tenure, you didn't even try, that would be pusillanimous. And then if you went into applying for tenure and trying to get tenure thinking, this is in the bag, I'm amazing. Um, that seems a bit vain. I mean, I guess it kind of depends on what you've done. There is such a thing as warranted confidence. So if you're vain, you'd have to have a little bit of unwarranted confidence. Like, well, I published that one paper and everybody loved it, and you don't even have the data to know how many people read it or anything. That paper was amazing. They should give me tenure just for that. That seems vain. Okay, well, anyway, you get the idea. As far as the feelings go, again, I have to speculate. I believe the magnanimous person has self-respect. They know what they're worthy of. They've got a good handle of what they're worthy of, and they go after things that they're worthy of, right? At least potentially. The pusillanimous person has some self-contempt. I'm not worthy. This person seems to be thinking, saying, feeling. The vain person is self-absorbed. They're just they have a very vivid appreciation of their own merit, and it's all sort of blown up too big in their own minds. So self-absorbed seems to be the right word there. Then there is the virtue concerned with small honors. It's not entirely clear which small honors Aristotle means. So even here I have to speculate even on the actions involved a little bit. But he does say, well, there are small honors too in life, and you could participate appropriately. That's not his phrasing. It's a little bit speculative. You could participate appropriately in trying to get the small honor, and that would be, the characteristic action of the person in the mean state. But you could also be unconcerned with small honors. You could be deficient. You could refuse to participate. Or you could be too concerned with small honors, right? That would be the name of the state. And then the characteristic action there would be that you would pursue small honors too eagerly. So I think he's talking about things like we're playing darts at the pub, um, we're playing Monopoly, um, you know, instead of tenure, you know, we've all published in this journal, and we're arguing about who's got the bigger readership, right? Maybe you're being too concerned with small honors there if the argument turns nasty, right? And you're denigrating other people, trying to say you've got the bigger readership. I don't know exactly what a small honor is, just like I don't know exactly what a big honor is. But we can think of more ordinary honors. I'm a better driver. Look at my amazing parallel parking, right? If you get too carried away with that, if you create too much animosity by insisting on a certain kind of superiority, right, then you're too concerned with small honors. You're pursuing that too eagerly. Um, so you could play Monopoly and be invested in the game and be okay whether you win or not. And that would seem to be participating appropriately. To give a different example, um, someone could either refuse to play Monopoly, which I've certainly done. It's too long, so maybe I'm unconcerned with small honors. Or maybe this is worse. You play, but you refuse to pay attention to the game, and you're not even playing right. Your play is very sloppy because you're inattentive and you don't care, and you got contempt for the game, and you've got contempt for the other people who are playing because it's a stupid game. I think that's worse than absolutely refusing to participate. So maybe we could add to the action area here, participating minimally with minimal attention, right? That could count as being unconcerned with small honors. And the person who's like hoarding money and hiding it under their shoe. I'm talking about monopoly money. And they're cheating when people look away, and then they're bad mouthing the way other people are playing the game. I've played with people like that. Those people are too concerned with small honors and they're pursuing them too eagerly. Okay, so I think the person who is appropriately concerned with small honors has self-respect and respect for others, right? And I mentioned self-respect with magnanimity. It's not surprising that the same feeling would come up here. It just has to do with smaller honors. So I know what I'm worthy of. I'm going to pursue that, and it's going to be steady and stable. Yeah, I'm solid. I'm appropriately concerned with small honors. I also have respect for others. Being unconcerned with small honors, there's contempt there, right? Is it contempt for oneself or is it contempt for the other people? Yes, both and. I mean, it could be one or the other depending on the person, but also it could be both, right? So any combination there of different kinds of contempt. And then again, the person too concerned with small honors is self-absorbed. They're too focused on what's so awesome about them and they're magnifying it and they're failing to appreciate what is worthy in other people. Okay, so I'll remind you, those were the virtues concerned with the distribution of goods. And now we get to this last broad category, virtues that help us get along with others. Okay, first of all, there's mildness, which has to do with anger. So the mild person feels and expresses appropriate anger. It's hard to come up with an action here, and Aristotle isn't terribly clear. So I think expressing anger is the action. So the mild person expresses it moderately, appropriately. The irascible person fails to express anger appropriately, um, doesn't feel it appropriately, right? And so that's deficient. Right. So I've got fails to express slash feel appropriate anger. What I mean is they're failing to feel appropriate anger, that's what that phrasing means, to be clear. And then, of course, the irascible person is too quick to anger and they get too angry when they're angry. Right. So there are different ways to be right and different ways to be wrong. The mild person doesn't get too angry and doesn't get angry too often. The irascible person might get too angry, might get angry too often, might do both. The irascible person might not get angry enough. They might get angry too rarely, or maybe both, right? Um, and of course, the feeling is appropriate anger, deficient anger, excessive anger, right? Okay, maybe we could go faster with this set of virtues. I don't know. We'll see. I am long-winded. Um, so truthfulness, this is not the same thing as honesty, so I'm not going to call it that. This is really about yourself, right? People have to talk about themselves. They have to say what they're capable of. I mean, think of making a resume. Truthfulness would be an important virtue for creating a resume. So I've got as the characteristic action of the truthful person states what he or she can contribute or offer, right? Let's see. That's what I meant. So this person states correctly what he or she can really offer, right? The boastful person claims too much for him or herself. You know, again, think of resumes. It's a good context for this virtue. I could do anything with Excel. I could do pivot tables. I could do any kind of formula. Um, I could do whatever you want. I could do anything an accountant could do, even though I don't have any training in accounting. I don't have any degrees in accounting. Like I'm so smart at Excel that makes up for my lack of accounting experience. Um, sometimes people sometimes people say things like that. I could do anything with this software. Um, self-deprecation, people belittle themselves. They put themselves down, or they don't put themselves forward when they should. They could be useful. They could be good at something, and they won't put themselves forward. So the way it seems to me, the way Aristotle is looking at truthfulness is you've got to make yourself useful to other people. It's a social skill. These are virtues that help us get along with others. That's the broad category. So the point of truthfulness, I think, although Aristotle isn't totally explicit, is making sure people know what you can do so you can actually be useful to them, right? Um, so when it comes to feeling, the truthful person wants to be seen, desires to be seen in an appropriately good light. They want you to know what's good about them. And maybe they're transparent about their failings too, but I think the emphasis for Aristotle is let people know what you're good at, right? And that's good for everybody, right? Um, Now you can participate better in the community, right? The boastful person desires to appear better than they really are. They tell exaggerated stories of themselves. They make claims that are far-fetched, right? And then the self-deprecating person is deficient, is lacking a desire to be taken seriously and to be seen in a good light. And you might think, well, that's fine. But again, there's this potential for being useful to others, and the self-deprecating person might miss that kind of opportunity. And that does seem like a genuine issue. Okay, and then there's wit. Um, I'm sure we have an intuitive idea what that is, but the characteristic action seems to be, well, you tell jokes and stories at the right time. When? Well, when it's time to relax, when it's time to just enjoy and have leisure, right? And the witty person helps it along, helps people relax and have a nice time and get along. The buffoon, is the excessive person here. Buffoonery is the excessive state. This person's constantly cracking jokes and telling stories. It gets inappropriate. Some of the stories are too colorful. Let's say some of the jokes are problematic, maybe offensive in some ways, right? So that's what the buffoon is like. The boorish person just, again, won't participate, won't get involved, won't help lighten the mood. So they're kind of useless in a certain context where, well, it's time to relax. It's time to just get along and have a nice time, and we don't need to do anything serious now. The boorish person just is kind of useless in that situation, right? And then there's a desire involved as the primary feeling here. So the witty person has this moderate desire to amuse. The buffoon has an excessive desire to amuse. The bore doesn't have much of a desire to amuse. Okay, and then finally, friendliness. Friendliness is something like hospitality slash courtesy, something along those lines. The friendly person, now we're getting to the characteristic action. They make you feel comfortable, they put you at ease. This could be when you visit their home, so then it's hospitality, or it could be in a more communal setting. But there could be one person who stands out for trying to make everybody else comfortable and at ease. So, so there's always that person who wants to go get the drinks for everybody and bring them back to the table, right? And maybe that person is friendly. If they're not overeager, that's just something they like to do and they don't make too big a deal out of it, then that seems like friendliness, right? But yeah, someone might hover, they might offer too much, they might always want to pay for all the drinks, not just go get them from the bar. That person is ingratiating. If there's no ulterior motive, that person is ingratiating. If they're trying to get something out of it, they're a flatterer. So I've got ingratiatingness slash flattery as the excessive state. It depends on the motive there. And then there's the surly person. Surliness is the deficient state. Fails to provide comforts. Fails to be courteous. Just isn't trying to make others comfortable and at ease, right? And then when it comes to feelings, the friendly person has an appropriate concern for the needs of others, right? There's a moderate desire, and the moderate desire might be strong. You mustn't think moderate means weak. I would certainly assume here, and there are other places where this is true, moderate is fairly strong. The moderate person, that the person who's actually friendly, has a pretty strong desire for others to be comfortable. It's fairly motivational, right? It's solid. Um, the ingratiating person or the flattering person just has an excessive desire, is obsequious, just it's off-putting unless you're easily flattered, right? And then you might think it's okay. And then of course the surly person lacks this interest in others' needs and comfort and so on. Okay, so those are the Aristotelian virtues. You might think things are missing. You might think this is too many things. I'm sure those are both true. These are conventional Greek virtues. Aristotle's not being radical here. He's being a conventional Greek. The analysis is really good. So we could take the analysis and apply it to other things. Like we might think patience is a virtue, right? And so we could apply the analysis and see what we get. We would get something interesting at least. Right. But yeah, he's being a conventional Greek here. Maybe this isn't the absolutely correct list of virtues. Also, justice isn't here. Justice is a special case. It is a virtue, but it's a special case. It gets its own treatment, and we're just not covering it here. So that is one thing that's deliberately missing. Aristotle just figures justice needs a separate discussion. And so he has that discussion later. Okay. So if we want to finish up book two, um, here's something I want to mention from chapter 8, which you don't have. And I only want to mention it, or I mainly want to mention it because it'll help with chapter 9, which you do have, which is in the reading. So this interesting thing I want to say from chapter 8 is the intermediate or the moderate or the mean, it isn't always in the middle. And I was just suggesting that. I said, the moderate desire might be actually really strong, right? So Aristotle gives some interesting examples in chapter 8. The intermediate could be closer to one extreme than another. This could be because of the object itself, or it could be because of ourselves. And he gives two different examples for the two different cases, right? So he says that bravery is closer to rashness than it is to cowardice. And that's because of the object itself. And he doesn't explain that much, so I have to take responsibility for the explanation. What he seems to be saying is the coward always runs away from danger. The brave person stands firm most of the time, or even pursues danger a lot of the time. The rash person is indiscriminate and stands firm or pursues all the time. You can tell statistically the brave person, the brave person and the rash person are statistically alike, right? Because the brave person is standing firm or pursuing most of the time. The coward runs away all of the time. So the brave person and the rash person are objectively, that's what he means by in the object, objectively closer together, and the coward is over here, right? And then when it comes to temperance, he says sometimes the mean is closer to one extreme than the other because of the way we are, because of our constitution. Well, that has to do with the discussion we had about insensibility and how, you know, people generally aren't insensible. That's not a thing, you know. Um, so our tendency is to get really close to pleasure. We want the pleasure. We want to get it, right? So, the indication, the recommendation is different in each kind of case, right? So what we fall into easily is the more contrary extreme, okay? But what we're statistically or objectively farther from is the more contrary extreme. In other words, um, cowardice and bravery are more opposed than bravery and rashness. And this leads to a different recommendation, and now we're getting into chapter 9. So Aristotle has told us, it's not always clear what to do. You're dealing with the particulars when you're dealing with virtue, right? So what general advice could we give? Um, Steer clear of the more contrary extreme, he says in chapter 9. But let's be clear about that. Um, when when you're dealing with the objective case, we'll just pick on bravery again. Um, Steer clear of cowardice. That's the big problem. So deal with your fear then, because I already said the coward is characterized by pain, which is caused by fear. Um, so deal with your fear, right? If we really want to make the recommendation really specific, that's a key part of becoming brave. You've got to steer more clear of cowardice than of rashness, because the brave person and the rash person are pretty close. So overconfidence is less of a problem than too much fear. I mean, that's what he's saying. He's not as explicit as I'm being, but this is what he's saying. Be somewhat like the rash person. Don't be like the coward at all. Um, so bolster your confidence. Well, unless you individually are really prone to it, but in general, for the average person, bolster your confidence, tamp down your fear, right? Um, and then in the case of temperance, it's the intemperance that's more contrary, because you have a tendency to go in that direction. So that's more contrary, because if you don't pay any attention, that's what you'll go toward. So bend away from that as if you were bending warped wood. I like that idea. Like, the wood is warped. You got to go in the opposite direction. Everybody loves pleasure. Everybody wants a Twinkie. Okay, maybe some people don't, but you know what I'm like, there's some sugary treat probably that you really want. That's how people are, right? So go in the other direction. Go away from the Twinkie. Put it out of your mind, right? Yeah, steer clear of that more contrary extreme. Go toward insensibility. At least in general, this is the general advice, but then also we're dealing with particulars. Pay attention to what you as an individual, as a particular, have a tendency to do. Whatever vice you tend toward, that's the more contrary extreme for you. Go away from that, bend away from that, as if again, as if you're bending the warped wood. Especially beware of pleasure. Aristotle almost ends with that point in chapter 9. Pleasure is a problem for pretty much everybody. Look out for it. If you enjoy something a lot, pay attention. That it doesn't mean don't do it. Pay attention. Pleasure can lead you astray. At least have self-knowledge. At least know what's giving you pleasure, so you can mark that and pay attention and navigate around that, whatever that involves. Okay, and then what Aristotle does end with in chapter 9 of book 2 is, we're only blamed when we deviate a long way from the mean. So he's kind of being encouraging there at the end. It's hard to be virtuous, it's hard to get it right, but don't worry, he's saying we're only blamed when we deviate a long way from the mean or the medial state or the medial action. Um, how far away we have to get from the mean to be blamed, to be blameworthy, that's a matter of particular judgment. Particulars are difficult. We can't say in general. So on the one hand, he's being encouraging. Don't worry so much. You'll only be blamed if you go far away from the mean, from the virtue. So don't get too worried. Can we actually say how much you could deviate? No. It's a matter of the particulars, right? So we can't say just in general, steer away from the more contrary extreme, go toward the mean, you'll be all right, he's saying. Okay, so we'll end on that note. Thanks for your attention.